Welcome to Real Chat with Kat, the podcast that's all about real conversations for real transformation. I'm your host, Kat Polsinelli, professional speaker, MC, and best-selling international author. Here, we tackle the tough stuff, the mud that we all have found ourselves in. We talk about the pivots, the challenges, and the victories that shape our lives and our businesses. From overcoming trauma and finding your voice to navigating life's unexpected twists, we get raw, honest, and open. You'll hear from inspiring guests who share their stories of resilience, healing, and growth. Whether it's breaking through emotional abuse, embracing self-worth, or thriving in entrepreneurship, you'll find connection, empowerment, and the tools to keep you moving forward. So grab your favorite drink, settle in, and get ready for stories that hit home and conversations that make a difference. Let's get real together. Hello, everyone, and thank you so much for joining me today on this episode of Real Chat with Kat. I am so excited to have you here with me today, and I have an amazing guest. I was so intrigued by just the way that your perspective is, John. And so I'm super excited to be able to bring him to the podcast and open this conversation to you guys and hopefully give people a little bit of insight and maybe a direction to go with understanding how they react to things or their perspective and then how that shapes everything else. So, John, thank you so much for joining the podcast today.
Thanks, Kat. I'm excited to be here. It's going to be fun.
Awesome. I am too. When you were talking about the prism of perspective, which I know we'll get into here in just a little bit, like I was so mind blown by the way that you had it laid out. And to me, it made so much sense. I'm a visual person as well. We talked about this. So being able to see that and all these different colors of the rainbow just made so much sense to me. So let me just let you do everybody a favor and introduce, who you are and what it is that you do.
Sure. I'm John Geraghty. I'm a optimal performance coach, and I primarily work with people that own their own businesses, that are mature in their careers and that are thriving in a lot of ways, but really want to make sure they continue to thrive moving forward. And one of the areas that I do a lot of work in is perspective, because we don't experience the world as it is, we experience the world as we are. And so, in other words, we set up our own frame that determines our life experience. And there's some things, some big factors that play a role in that we like to play with when we're doing our coaching and development work, so that people understand, like, what are the knobs and levers that we can play with to create lives that are more fulfilling and that create more joy and impact. So that's really the purpose of the Prism of Perspective and the work that I do.
I love that. And, I love that you talk about, I'm sorry, I have something in my eyeball, of course, as soon as we get started. I know that you talk about how we all see the world through our own lens. And this was one of the reasons why I really loved talking to you before this as well, is because we do tend to get in this societal setting where we're expected to see things a certain way, and then we expect everyone else to see things that way as well, and then we wonder why we clash and there's no communication and there's so much misunderstanding, and then we don't realize the effects that this has all the way across our lives, from our personal development and the way that we deal with friends and family and everything around us, to how we are dealing with things within our business. And especially for us that are in the coaching space or in a realm where we're trying to help other people, it's very, very important to be aware of our own perspectives, but also being able to see other people so we can be more open, right, to helping them reframe how they're dealing with their challenges, and leading them down a path that works best for them.
Yeah, I think that, as you say, like, so we have our own individual experiences, and then it's set inside the societal context, right? So we're given a framework or frameworks in story, and then based on where we've grown up, our own experiences, our interpretations, some assumptions we've made about that, we then have our own beliefs about ourselves, who we are, who others are, how the world shows up. And that actually acts as this this lens through which we see the world. There's millions of bits of information to process at any given moment, but we can't process that much information. So what happens is our senses break it down to look for what we expect to see. In other words, we end up seeing the world we anticipate. And so,
Mm,
one of the things that's so important is to make sure that the belief systems that you have about yourself, about others in the world, are in alignment with the world that you want to experience. I don't mean that we want to be lying to ourselves, right? But if you're telling yourselves disempowering stories, right? If you're telling yourself about, you're emphasizing your flaws and your weaknesses and what you've done wrong, etc., you're actually setting up a framework for more of, what am I doing wrong? Where can I criticize myself? Right? How can I diminish my self-confidence? That's essentially the frame. On the flip side, if we look at it and give ourselves a hero's story, right? We talk about like the challenges that we faced, how we've overcome up different obstacles, what are the gifts and talents and passions we use to get to where we are. Then it actually gives us a frame of empowerment, right? We have expectation of our own self-efficacy so that we're going to be able to be successful. And so the front side of the prism of perspective really is all about, like, what are your beliefs? And you mentioned curiosity. We're going to land on beliefs, but we don't want to hold them so tightly that they become rigid, right?
mm.
And then we're with certainty, when we have certainty about the way we see the world, then we're not open, like you said, to other people's interpretations and their experiences. So, yes, we want to understand who we are, what our gifts and talents and passions are, how we want to contribute to the world, what we believe to be true, and then have the confidence that we can stand there with those beliefs and then take in other information and be influenced by it. Doesn't necessarily mean we go, oh, okay, I'll drop what I believe, but like, hey, that's an interesting perspective. I didn't see that. How do
Hmm.
I add that to my existing belief system? Or how does that inform my existing belief system so we can continue to evolve? Does that make
I,
sense?
yes. And when you're talking about it being rigid, I immediately think of the way that I used to think, coming out of an abusive relationship. There was only one way that I had the ability at that point in time that I felt like I could see anything and everything, right? And when I finally broke free from that, while there was a lot still coming at me from that place, there was this like beautiful open door, right? Like far off in the distance where I was starting to able to have the ability to see like, okay, day by day, things aren't the exact same as they used to be. So obviously, there's some form or way to kind of shift or change. Now, I didn't understand any of that in the beginning, right? I didn't understand how much our beliefs and the beliefs that others have put on us or that we have absorbed as our own becomes part of your everyday story. And ultimately, how much power you actually have to change that. I think that more of us have grown up in a space where what we are taught is what it is, and it's very hard to get out of that. So like you were saying, the rigidness of that, right? And I do think that sometimes that comes from just things that we experience or things that we experience on a regular basis that's kind of, in a way, for me, it was pounded to the point
Right.
to where I couldn't see anything else. And this perspective was actually really interesting to me. And I love that you state that you can still have your perspective, but don't tie it down so much to the point to where you don't have the ability to understand somebody else's. It doesn't mean that it has to overtake yours, but it could influence, right, that growth of how you see something. And I think that that's something that we are not taught enough, is that we have the ability and we should be pulling in this ability to continually want to grow and be influenced by other things, because we did that when we were young, right? You learned something and you were constantly learning how to do better at it. And I feel like when I got to a certain point as an adult, I forgot that we still get to do that.
Yeah. So one of the things you're talking about really is the concept of a fixed versus a growth mindset.
Yeah.
And, we, especially, as our society has become more bifurcated, right? And so you have people living in different intellectual bubbles about what they believe to be true.
Hmm.
And so, and then identity wise get so attached to that belief system that it becomes dangerous for them in their identity to allow for anything else. So rather than remaining open, curious, and committed to learning what's actually true, a lot of people become closed, defensive, and committed to defending their existing belief systems. And so what I find interesting is a lot of times you'll hear people say, we don't communicate with one another, you know, effectively. And so I'm always like, okay, so let's do that. And they'll be like, well, I don't talk about politics or religion is often what you hear, right? I don't talk about politics or
Yeah.
religion. And so essentially what that person is saying is no, I actually do want to be rigid and closed and defensive. I don't want to allow myself to explore the possibility that some of these things that I've set up as my beliefs aren't actually true. I'm more comfortable being right in my head, but wrong in reality, as long as
Mm,
I don't have to face the possibility that I've been kind of doing things based, off of things that aren't really grounded in truth.
hmm.
And so one of the things that so if we look at I'm going to run through the Prism of Perspective real quick. So
Yeah.
anybody who's ever seen the Dark Side of the Moon album cover, just think of that, right? So it's how a prism works, right? Light comes into the prism, and inside white light, as we know, are all the colors of the rainbow. So if you think of your life as white light, your life and all the opportunities are coming at you, and again, there's millions of bits of information. We're going to filter that down based on what our beliefs are, how we generate energy, and how we remain present is going to determine whether we see the world or see this experience as being victims, fighters, negotiator, contributor, collaborator, partner, or co-creator. And those are the seven colors of the rainbow on the backside. So if you think of the Dark Side of the Moon album cover, white light comes in, runs through our beliefs, our energy, and our presence, and it shows up on that backside. But if we're so attached to not allowing for other things to come in and we're just going to stay rigid here, it's going to shut us down. The piece around energy that I really think plays a huge role in how we shape this on an ongoing basis is like, what are your positive psychology practices? And at some
Mm,
level, I think that's about like, what do you do intentionally to shape your framework so that it's expansive and growing and supportive, right? And I think
yeah.
of them often as like clubs that you might have on a golf bag. So you might have like gratitude, forgiveness, compassion, visualization, breath work, meditation, mindfulness, journaling, prayer. Like all of those are alternative things that you might do to impact intentionally from your part, not society's part, how you see the world. And part of it is like, are you doing the things that are necessary in order for you to have the perspective that gives you choice? Or are you neglecting that? And so many people don't even think about positive psychology practices as something that they would intentionally engage with,
Mm,
or they have them very narrowly focused. I do this, but I would never do that, right?
hmm.
That's actually of the devil or whatever it happens to be. That practice is bad. This practice is good.
Yeah.
And so I think, really being open to that, thinking about how are you engaging in a way that's going to shape that lens for you so you can continue to evolve rather than to, if you show up at I'm 62, if I'm 82 and I still have exactly the same beliefs at 82 that I had when I'm 62, I wasn't really paying attention, right?
Yeah.
I was just trying to defend things. And I see so many people that are like, I'm gonna die with the exact same perspective that I have today. I'm holding on to it so tightly. Then
Hmm.
you're right. We're not going to be able to communicate because you don't really want to communicate. You may want to share your thoughts, but you're not really interested in gaining new insights.
Yeah.
Does that resonate with how you kind of experience things? And what are some of the practices you use?
Yeah, I kind of this makes me think of like when we think of science,
Uh-huh.
like science doesn't stay in one thing because if they do,
Right.
we'd never be able to explore and learn other things, right? Inventions, same thing. Somebody
Right.
tells you it's
Scientific
never going to
method is
work.
all about
Yeah.
challenging what you believe to be true.
Yeah. And so that immediately is like where my brain went. I'm like, okay, if we think about it that way, right? To me that makes sense. Not that I even thought about it like that several years ago. But we have inventions and we have science and we have things that are evolving all the time. So why wouldn't we want to fall into that category? And I think that, for me, I think it was just because it wasn't a conversation.
Mhm.
When I was growing up, I had a great family and everything, but we never discussed like personal development. We never discuss like, okay, this person doesn't believe in what you believe in. So what kind of questions can you ask to understand better, right? So that you guys can be on a more neutral level where you agree to disagree, right? But you understand what it is that they're saying. So there you've gained insight and now you can grow from there. Like that just wasn't part of the conversations that we had.
Yeah, and even the idea of agreeing to disagree, which sometimes you got to get there, but sometimes people get there before they're actually even try to understand. Like, we're going to agree to disagree, and they say, okay, so exactly what is it that I believe that you are disagreeing with? They don't really
Mm,
even know, right? There,
yeah.
it's a couple bullet points, a characterization. This is your belief system, and you're like, well, not really. Would you like to know what I believe so that you can then explore? And it's
Hmm.
interesting you brought up the idea of science. There's a book that I think does a great job talking about this. It's called "What's Our Problem" by Tim Urban, and he's talking essentially about politics, but he's really talking about communication. And he says one of the challenges that we often have is that we have this perception that people that are very far on the left are extremely liberal, and people that are very far on the right are really conservative. And his perspective
Hmm.
is that's not actually true. It wraps around, and that when you get far anywhere, you're either left or right, you're illiberal, because liberal actually means to be open and curious and committed to learning. That's kind of the definition of
Okay.
liberalism, right? That's what liberalism means, right? You are open to exploring things different. And so if you're really far on the left and you have a certainty that the way you see the world is the way that it is, right? Then you're not really liberal. You may be super progressive, but you're not actually liberal. And on the right side, if you're willing to burn things down to go to some specific point that you think is the place when you're not conservative, you're destructive. And so what he suggests is that we think about how we communicate as much more important, and that you want to find out, like, are people what he calls high rung or low rung? And
Hmm.
high rung are the highest rung, he says, are scientists. And he doesn't mean people that are scientists professionally, but people that are open to, here's my hypothesis. Like, I believe this is the best way for a society to thrive. And I think this is the way that taxes make sense, or this is the way that regulation really makes sense. I'm going to throw it out there as a scientist, and I want other people to go, well, here's what's wrong with that theory. And I'm going to be
Mm.
open to it, right? Lower level is sports fans. They're still high rung. If you're a real sports fan, you want people to play fairly. You don't want them to cheat, but you kind of have I want this team to win. But as long as you're still open to, at the end of the day, go, yay, your team actually did outperform my team. That's okay. When you get into low rung, they have attorneys, and attorneys, he says, are people that know the truth, but are willing to lie and mislead, and right, to keep they want to
Hmm.
suppress information that doesn't support they're not really looking for the truth. They're looking to win. And then the very, very low level are people that can't see the truth. And so if you think about how you engage, whether whatever it is that's meaningful, like, are you coming to the world as a scientist? Are you coming to the world with an open perspective that I have my beliefs, I'm going to share them, and I'm going to remain open. I'm going to throw it out like a hypothesis. I believe this to be true. Tell me I'm wrong. Where am I wrong? And I think that that's an interesting, like, as you said, really, are we being scientists in the world, or are we the low, low, low level he calls golems? um, you know, from people
Yes,
that are
Lord of the Rings, say so.
Lord of the Rings, right? Yeah, and he's slumbering low, low level energy, and it just kind of gives you that perspective of how am I showing? How am I showing up? You
That's a
know,
beautiful analogy too, though. And when I think about that, you had asked me about some of my practices and things that I do now. And one of the things that I started doing was asking things like that to my teenagers, which my boys are now 21 and 17. So I guess I don't have two teenagers anymore. But that's something that I do on a regular basis with them. And I started doing that several years ago when I realized that I'm not going to understand anybody else's side if I'm not willing to ask the question and actually hear what they have to say. And so that kind of shifted the way that I parented from this, do what I say, do it this way, what you're doing is wrong. And okay, well, I hear what you're saying. I think it should do this way. Explain to me why you think that your way makes sense. But what was actually really interesting was there were times where my kids had a better understanding, or I'm like, okay, you know what? That actually makes sense. All right. So it's really interesting because I think, and I think that especially the way that I grew up, the parent was the parent, the child was the child. But being in this phase with my kids of I'm no longer supposed to be the one that holds all the balls in my hands, but let's let you learn and understand. I have learned so much from them as well. And I mean, they're in a different generation than I am. They're in a different time in the world that I am. So, of course, their perspectives are completely different from mine as well. But it's been really interesting and also a lot of fun to
Uh-huh.
be able to ask those questions and kind of get their feedback and learn from a completely different generation and completely different perspective than what I've ever been able to see. And I don't know, it's like when their friends come over, it's one of my favorite things is like start asking them questions and getting them on a roll on stuff because it's really neat to understand how they are starting to perceive things and then have a conversation of, okay, well, I understand that, but have you thought about it this way? And I think that we need that more in the world too, for
Yeah.
especially the younger generation. But
All of us. I mean, the older generation, like, I think when I look at my generation, so many people are so rigid in their, they've locked in, they feel like they've learned what they're learning. They're now, you know, crusty instead of being flexible, right?
yeah.
And so yeah, I love what you said there. And when you were having those conversations, here's what I also have learned. When I seek to impose my perspective on my children who are 23 and 21, um, I'm not really effective. When right,
Yeah.
even if in my from my perspective it's an area that I have great expertise and experience, etc., if I deliver it from on high, it doesn't really get received well.
Yeah.
If I'm open and curious and I share, like, first understand what their perspective is, and even there's an idea, a straw man argument is when I try to misinterpret what you're saying in such a way that your argument's easy to beat, right? A
Hmm.
steel man argument is where I look at your argument and try to add strength to it, right?
Ooh.
So I look at your argument and somebody says, whatever that, let's say someone hypothetically believes that, you know, very low taxes for is the most effective way to have a more fair society, and so I might argue with them, say, well, I do believe that taxes can play a disincentive, so it might stifle initiative and things along those lines. And so if taxes were super progressive, you could see that eventually there would be a place where you would begin to have, less prosperity, etc. Um, Now I've given more strength to your argument, and most likely, if I do that, I now have an opportunity. Let me share a different perspective that may not be as familiar to you, right? And now, because we've helped to strengthen theirs, they're most likely going to listen to ours better. I find that to be so true with
Mm.
my kids. Like, if whatever, yeah, I get that and I can understand that. And maybe that is completely true, but maybe this other thing. And the less I find that I try to force anything, whether I'm leading a team or my kids or whatever happens to be, the more receptive. Because even if you think about it, like if you're pushing against something, the other side pushes back.
Hmm.
But if you're really not, there's nothing for them to push against. They push and you just kind of absorb and go, yeah, that's interesting. Eventually there's it's not as much fun to push. So yeah, yeah, perspective. The prism of perspective is a, it's a tool that I talk about so that people can think about, like, be clear on what you believe, and that the stories you're telling yourself about yourself and the world, et cetera, has you looking for a safe, abundant, collaborative, partnering world, and be open to see what you might be missing. And so, like I talked about those, positive psychology practices, I think thinking about, like, what are you doing to generate the physical energy, the emotional energy, the mental energy that you need to engage in your world as a practice is really important. I was speaking to a person that I'm friendly with who had recently had a bit of an emotional challenge, and they actually checked themselves into like a 30-day outpatient situation. And we were talking about, getting back into the world and things along those. And I was just talking about, like what are some of the things that you do to strengthen your emotional state on an ongoing
Mm,
basis? Right? What are your practices, rather than just hoping that all of a sudden your emotional state's going to be great? And
mm-hmm,
it was really nothing. I said, so if physically you wanted to get better, what would you do physically? Exercise. I said, okay, so you have to do that physically. Why would we not think it's just as important to have practices on that side? Right. And so I think building those practices into our lives gives us an opportunity to be resilient, right? To see the world from a great place, to put ourselves in a great state. So we're seeing opportunity rather than, all the negatives in the world. And, just
yeah.
being really intentional about it. It changes our life's experience. There are circumstances that absolutely are happening in our world and they influence us, but it's really our interpretation of those experiences that have the biggest impact.
Mm-hmm.
Right. And so if we're not being intentional and taking control of that, we're giving away a ton of our power. Right.
Yeah. And I think that's interesting when you talk about, giving away a ton of your power as well. Is I don't think that we think in that regard, right? I know I didn't for a really long time, right? For me, power and control was the physical things that I could handle, right? How my day went, my schedule, how my kids were doing. And I realized that the more that I learn to let go of those items, because that can always shift, right? And the more that I learn to focus on my perspective or my emotion in a moment, I was able to redirect and control more than what I had ever had the ability to be able to do, which ultimately led to the ability to handle larger capacities of things that get thrown at you
Right.
without it not only disrupting your day, but like completely obliterating your day or your next week or your next month, right? Which used to happen to me. If I had an argument with someone, I would ruminate and go through that argument and their side for like hours on end, right? Even if I was trying to do other stuff, I was still having that conversation back and forth. And what I realized is I was like, well, first off, what good is it doing? I have absolutely no clue what they would actually be saying. And
Right.
where is this actually getting me? What is it solving? Is it solving anything? Well, no, it's not. It's just giving me a space to be angry, except for in my head, which then disrupts everything else. And so realizing that we have more control than what we think, it's just not in the way that we think control is, was a really interesting turning point for me
Yep. Yep.
to start to understand.
I try to use the word influence rather than control, because
Oh,
control,
okay.
I think, implies a level of control we don't have. Right.
Okay.
Like when you start to say, what do you really have control over? You really have control over your thoughts, your beliefs, right? Your practices, like you, right?
Mm-hmm.
Once you get outside of you, you don't you don't control your kids. You don't control the people in the audience. You don't control really anything. Now you have influence, and the closer in, right? So we have like a ourselves, and then outside we have people that, in situations over which we have a fair amount of influence, and then we have limited influence, and then we have no influence. Really, once you start getting outside there, then it starts to be, does it make any sense whatsoever to be placing energy and effort on something over which we have no influence? Right.
Yep.
I was a financial advisor, and So when somebody takes an investment, right? And let's say they give you $100,000, right? And they get nothing back, right? It's not a 0% rate of return, it's a negative 100% rate of return. And so when you think about the energy and focus and attention that you have, which is a limited resource, and you say, I'm going to take that limited resource that I have and I'm going to go invest it in an investment where I'm not only going to not get anything back from it, I'm going to lose all of my investment. My time and energy is gone, my focus, my peace of mind, all those things are gone. Like you wouldn't do that. But so much time people spend outside of their circle of influence. And again, so becoming aware of where is that for you?
Mm-hmm.
And I think again, if I'll look at the prism of perspective, the backside is all about the space between stimulus and response. Like, are you present? Because in some ways, if I think about the prism, like the first thing is kind of like, what are your existing beliefs? The bottom part
Mm-hmm.
is like, how do you generate energy? And also, how do you influence your future beliefs? Right? Because you have this set of beliefs, like what are the practices? Like where's your gratitude, your compassion, your forgiveness, your visualization? Like what, because whatever you're doing down here ultimately goes back up and it becomes part of your belief system. And then the backside is your presence. And the presence is, are you actually present in the moment so you can act in alignment with your aspirational vision of yourself? Or are you triggered in that space and you're just reactive? And so that you may say, I have this vision of myself as someone who's peaceful and loving and kind and compassionate and collaborative. And you're like, great. So how did you show up the other day? Oh, I bit that guy's head off because he said something that I didn't completely agree with. And you're like, okay, maybe we can work on the present side there. Like, how do you, in Viktor Frankl in The Man's Search for Meaning talks about the space between stimulus and response as, that's where we make our meaning, right? Something happens and then you have to figure out like, what's your opportunity there? And so I think all of those play together to give us our life experience. And by being conscious of the different levels and ways we can play with it, we get to create our lives in the way that we want to, our life experience. Because that's, at the end of the day, that's what's going to determine your life, right? Like what were the
Mm-hmm.
emotions you were feeling all the time? You could have a beautiful car, great house, wonderful, whatever. But if you're angry and jealous and vindictive and spiteful, that is what you are,
Yeah.
right? You were those things and you drove a nice car.
Yep.
That was your life experience. It wasn't like, oh yes, and because I was in a nice car. No, nothing happened. You were still vindictive and whatever. And so it's really thinking about like, how do I stay present to make sure um, I'm showing up as this idealized version of myself, or at least getting as close as possible.
Mm-hmm.
And that's,
I
and I think that's what many of us really want to do, like have that experience of ourselves as our highest and best, rather than some instinctive animalistic version of ourselves that, is, us showing up at a lower level than what's possible.
yeah. Yeah. And I love this idea of, or not even idea, but the concept of, you know, seeing things different, but also being present. Because again, I don't feel like that's something that we talk about a lot in our society because it's always go, go, go. And so I'm curious to know, from all the things that you've seen and the way that you've created this, and which I love this prism aspect. It's just I love visuals. What kind of got you to this point? Like, what do you feel like were some of the things that you experienced that kind of gave you this epiphany or understanding or perspective to decide, like, because I know we all have a backstory, right?
All right, we
That
got
leads
plenty of
into.
backstory. Yeah. So I grew up, um, I look at it like when I've thought through this actually, like even thought about when, my first memories, I came from a pretty dysfunctional family, like a lot of people do. My parents divorced when I was 8. I never really saw my dad again, but for maybe, an hour here or there, till he died. So probably a total of 24 hours collectively over that time. Um, but I remember like having feeling like I had to show up a particular way. So kind of having like a facade.
Mm-hmm.
Um, I had been recognized early on for like academic and athletic achievement. And so that became a big identity thing for me. Um, so it was really important to present myself a particular way rather than to be a particular way. And eventually that stuff stopped working when I was no longer, you're everybody's, not everybody, but in a small pond, it's not as hard to be a big fish. You start to get in a bigger pond, you start to realize like, oh, I'm not as big a fish. And if your whole identity was built around the idea that you're the biggest fish, then stuff starts collapsing, right?
Mm-hmm.
And being kind of recognized for achievement and things along those lines actually starts to build, for any parents listening, it actually builds in the kids a fixed mindset rather than a growth mindset. And they begin to identify themselves as being this thing, this fixed thing, rather than just we're moving through life and we're continually learning and growing and developing. So for like 15 years, from 14 to 29, I kind of stagnated. Um, all through high school, college, and the beginning after that. I drank alcoholically, in that I would often trying to escape from discomfort. And
Mm.
so I was, it wasn't like I was under a bridge. I got through high school, I got through college, I had a job, things along those lines. But it was definitely big time getting in my way. And it wasn't until I realized that path was absolutely not going to work for me that I began to look at other things. And so that was 33 years ago. And so over that time, I became like a voracious learner because I hadn't really learned for
Mm-hmm.
like high school and college. So I was like, I kind of wanted to prove, like, I don't know what I wanted to do, but I started reading and learning, et cetera. And so I've been exposed to great thought leaders for the last 33 years who were kind enough to do a bunch of work and put it down in a book that I could read. And then as a coach, I've worked with, hundreds, if not thousand people over time that have also been exploring how do they continue to grow and become their best. And so that evolutionary process, I think, helped to shift me. And and then the prism of perspective just kind of came out of like all of the different things I was exposed to, thinking about like, how do you make sense of all this? Right? You look at the idea of that we see the world differently and that there's perspectives, and we look at the different energies that people might resonate at, and you think about like, well, what's causing that? And like, where are the places that we can plug in? And so, for me, I was, understood, okay, what I believe to be true about myself, my identity belief is the hugest thing, but also what I believe to be true about others, right? Because if I believe others are unfair and dishonest and whatever, then I'm going to look for that every time I engage with you.
Mm-hmm.
I'm going to look for proof of and I'm going to say, oh my God, Kat, yeah, I saw when she was doing this, I could tell she wasn't really being honest in what she was saying. Her eye twitched and I knew the whole time, everything, right? So you're going to look for what it is, or the
Yeah.
world, right? I think the world is dangerous. Somebody tells me it's a dangerous world, then I'm going to look for all the danger. I'm going to look for all that rather than, oh no, the world for the most part is collaborative, right? We have this idea of survival of the fittest, where if you look at evolution, I'm a believer in evolution. It's really a collaborative process, right? You think about even inside the human body, there's tons, right? There's tons of organisms that aren't ours that are critical, right? Mitochondria is generating all the energy. You have the gut microbiome that's kind of doing all the digestive, and they're not us. They're other entities that are helping us exist. And the same thing is true throughout the world. So you start to say, is the world really dangerous, or is it quite collaborative? Is it working together?
Mm.
And so it changes your frame of reference. And then if you begin to look for the opportunity to collaborate and partner and to co-create, you see a different world than if you look at the world like I'm a victim or I'm a fighter and it's dangerous. And so I think all those things kind of collectively come together to shift, and you land where you land and you realize like this is just a mile marker on the journey. I'm on mile 62. Who knows how many miles this goes, but it's different than it was at 61, and it's, radically different than it was at 29. And it'll be different than it is at 70. And if I thought that I was going to show up believing the same things I believe at 70 that I do at 62, well, what would be the point of doing it?
Yeah.
Right. And
Yeah.
so, my opportunity is that. And then one of the, you talked to like early on, like, what do I really want to do? I want to change at some level the way people think about aging pretty significantly. I think that I know that there are genetic components, but they're much smaller than people want to attribute them. And we don't have to age as rapidly as the vast majority of people are aging. And so again, when you're thinking about it, like, what are the things that you're doing to be physically vital so that you can continue to be a contribution for a really long time rather than feel like, I'm done. I can't imagine,
Hmm.
65 is an age where a lot of times people are thinking about retiring or whatever. I can't imagine 3 years from now thinking I'm done being a contribution, right? Like, this doesn't make any sense. Like, oh yeah, I've contributed everything I have contribute. When what's true for me is I'm way more effective at contributing than I've ever been, right? I've learned more, I've experienced more, I've, built some skills. So that's kind of the way I look at it.
I love that. It's a beautiful perspective. And thank you for sharing the backstory as well. Because I do think, and I know you kind of talk to parents very briefly. I agree with that. And I was raised the same way. Again, I love my family. But it was definitely um academic achievements. I was in a lot of sports. So there was a lot of like, how do you be the best of the best? And I do think that that really shifted how I saw myself. And I do feel
And
like,
even some of the how do you become is actually growth mindset.
mm,
The recognition, like, if somebody's like, you're the fastest, you're the best, you're the smartest, you're the whatever, then it's an identity belief. If the same event happens and you cheer your kid for winning the game, and one is you won the game, man, you are the fastest and the best and the strongest, it has a different landing than if, congratulations, it's clear that you've really worked hard on this skill. Wow, you've really developed that capability. I can see the hard work paying off. One leads to someone who's like, oh, I'm just moving through life and continually evolving based on my contribution. The other
hmm.
is I have a set box of capabilities that's going to allow me to do X, Y, or Z. And so it shows up differently. And with people that have a fixed mindset, they tend not to be willing to risk failure,
Yeah.
And so what they do is play it safe. The way I did it was stopped trying, right? So you look at those years, and it was like I realized, like, okay, I'm not necessarily the smartest person here, but if I really show up and try and I'm still not the smartest, then I've proven I have limited capability. But
Mm,
if I don't really try, I can always be like, well, if I tried, you know what I
yeah.
mean? And that's kind of what shows up for a lot of people in that way. So,
Yeah. No, I
it's
appreciate that because I used to definitely fear any type or any form of failure at all. And it's obviously something that's still like pings, but I know that it's not going to destroy my life, right? To be able to test it out. But I was like that for a really long time where it was like, no, no, no. I know I'm good at this and I know I'm good at this. So if I stay in this,
right. Stay in my
nobody can
lane.
tell me different,
Right.
right?
Right.
Versus, I don't know how I can do this, but I want to learn and see what happens. And it took me a while to understand that failure isn't the end of the line.
Right.
Failure is the beginning of deciding and figuring out who you are and where you want to go. And that's what
Yeah.
gives those opportunities. And so again, I think it comes back to what you keep saying is shifting our perspective and shifting the way that we see things. And I think it's also shifting the way that we use words as well, because it really can have a debilitating effect on what you decide to do or not to do, or, move forward or not move forward, is the words that you were choosing to use. Try was one of those words that I took out of my vocabulary.
Yeah.
And I had a coach that was working with me, and she was like, "You say try every single time." She said, "And I feel like you use try as a way to say, well, if I do it and it doesn't work, right? So you kind of get yourself off the hook instead of,
Right.
okay, well, I did this, but it didn't work. So what can we do next?" And I realized that I really was using that for like absolutely, that was like my default of my safe space. And so I stopped using that word. It was either I was doing it, or the plan was to do it, or it's on my calendar to do something, but I stopped using try because that was my default, my safe space to be that in between, but not fail, but
Yeah, and it gives you that idea that you begin, once you say I try, you're beginning to set two visuals in effect. One of you succeeding and one of you not succeeding, right? So if you're saying I'm
hmm
going to try to do this, you're setting up a visual of success and a visual of not success. And then your psychology, your subconscious doesn't really know where you want to go. Whereas if you are clear, you're doing this. And I had this conversation actually with one of my daughters the other day. She was talking about something she was trying to do, and I said, "Well, you're doing that." And she's like, "Well, I'm not totally succeed." And I'm like, "Yeah, well, but that's what you're doing, right? You're
hmm
doing that thing." And along the journey, there's always times where like, "Oh, I got some feedback." It's that particular way I was doing that. That's not working, but it doesn't mean I'm not doing that. And I think,
hmm
like you said, words matter a lot, especially the words we say to ourselves.
Yeah.
One of my favorite quotes is never say anything about yourself that you don't want to be more true because you begin to make it true, right?
Ooh.
Whatever you're saying about, I'm not good at this or I'm not like, unless you want to die with that being true, you probably want to stop that. It's okay to say, historically, I've been challenged by, right? But I'm getting better, I'm growing, I'm learning, right? But don't own your shortcomings.
Mm,
Um, as because again, once it becomes your identity belief and you begin to attach to it, you actually defend it, right? You defend
yeah.
your shortcomings. And so we really want to be conscious and careful about that in my perspective. So
Yeah. Oh, John, thank you so much. This is such a beautiful conversation. And there's so many different directions that we could continue to go. And I'm just really hoping that someone who's listening is getting some type of light bulb moment or perspective shift, right? If you've been feeling called to this. So do us all a favor, John, where can they find you? How can they follow you? How can they be in your world?
um, well, on social media, Coach John Geraghty, and I'll have Sherry send all the information for all the places that I can be contacted on social media, etc. I'll also have her send out a graphic for the Prism of Perspective so people can look at that if they'd like to.
Yes.
That you can put in the show notes. Um,
Yeah.
and my big encouragement is to recognize that we're all creating our own life masterpiece. And Michelangelo was talking about, somebody asked him about the statue of David and like how did he carve the statue of David into the marble? And he's like, I didn't carve David into the marble. What I did is I removed everything from the marble that wasn't David. And I think sometimes we feel like we have to add so much to ourselves where if we really think about like just getting authentic and real and understanding like who are you called to be? It doesn't have
Mm,
to be somebody else, but like what is your real natural way of being?
yeah.
Obviously we're going to continue to grow, but let's grow authentically as ourselves because we're never going to be great at being anything other than who we are. And so that's kind of what I would throw out there.
Yeah. Oh,
Good
no,
deal.
that's beautiful. I love it, John. Thank you so much.
Thank
To
you for having me
everybody.
on. It was a lot of fun.
Yeah, of
Yeah.
course. To everybody else that's out there, we'll make sure we have all the information in the show. So we'll make it super easy for you to find the information and to be able to get in touch with John. And you know what? I think we're gonna leave it on what John had to say. I really do believe that we are meant to be here to continually learn and grow. And if you're not doing that, what are you doing? And so I challenge you to think of how you see things in the world and the direction that you want to grow, right? And being more of you, because that is ultimately what you have. And I can definitely say from putting the facade on to choosing to just be freaking me, this is 10 times better
Whole lot
than
easier, isn't
anything.
it?
So much
Easier
easier.
and fun, right? So like
So
lean
much
into
fun.
yourself and know
Yes.
that we're all great the way we are.
Yes.
And so anyway, thank you again, Kat.
You are so welcome. Yes, to everybody else out there, have a wonderful day. I hope you got some amazing perspectives. And until next time, do one thing positive for someone each and every day and see the difference that it makes in your life. Catch you later.
Thank you so much for tuning in to Real Chat with Kat today, where real stories meet real solutions. If you loved today's episode, don't forget to subscribe, leave us a review on Apple, and share this with someone who may also need to hear this as well. Let's also keep the conversation going. Follow me on socials at The Lotus Effect, connect with our incredible guests, and remember, you are never alone. Your story matters, and you have the ability and the power to rewrite it. You always have a choice. Until next time, stay strong, stay inspired, and keep showing up as the incredible, unstoppable